Alex Chemmer over here at Movements for Life. Our next restorative segment is taking us to some local mobility for the anterior hip, so hip flexors and quads. There's a couple of different postures that we need to get into to focus on some different musculature. So that said, let's talk a little bit about hip flexors. Hip flexors as it relates to daily posture and sitting, currently in, it's much more mainstream today than it was a number of years ago in terms of the effects of sitting and what it does to the hip complex and how it affects our entire body. So giving the anterior hip more ability to load and stretch is going to give us the ability to engage our glute more. Hence, there's so much more glute work being done to combat this. So it's definitely, the industry's going in the right direction from that standpoint. So I just want to add to it a little bit with some of our local mobility and stretches that we do here, and then how that transfers into some of the other programming that we do later on with glute activation and so forth. So local mobility as it relates to hip flexor, we're going to talk about a straight-legged posture first at the knee, and this relates to gait with propulsion on that back leg. So a lot of hip extension. As the hip is extending, the anterior hip needs to be able to let go to allow that motion to take place. So at that point, a simple hip flexor stretch against the wall, back knee is nice and straight, my foot is going to be at least straight if not toed in slightly, and all I'm going to do is drive my pelvis towards the wall. And in doing so, I'm going to get a nice anterior hip stretch, so hip flexor stretch. It wouldn't be wrong if you got a nice calf stretch because that back leg is in a position of dorsiflexion, and especially if you can emphasize keeping that heel down. So you get a nice twofer out of it where you get hip flexor and calf at the same time, which is going to be actually ideal. So as I drive my pelvis forward, I want to get a nice hip tuck, so a nice glute squeeze so that I'm not arching through my lower back. So with the hip flexors, when I fall into an anterior tilt, this is going to promote shortening throughout my hip flexor. So as I do any hip flexor or quad stretches, I want to be able to stay in a hip tuck, a posterior tilt, and that's going to gap or put load or stretch on that hip flexor. All right, so straight-legged posture first, same concept, hip tuck, drive hip forward. Now from here, let's get into some kneeling variations, and what's going to happen is as I kneel, kind of like a 90-90 hip flexor stretch, I want to focus on the same thing. I don't want to be all arched out. As I'm driving my pelvis forward, I actually want to stay in that tuck posture, and that again is going to put more load and stretch on that hip flexor, making sure lower back is not extending. All right, so I don't need to go through a very large range of motion here because typically I won't be able to stay in that tuck tailbone, that posterior tilt. So I do stay relatively short range of motion. It doesn't take much. So many are restricted through the anterior hip, so some is good, more is not better. It's how you get there more than how far can you get. All right, so I'm keeping that back knee bent. Obviously, I'm on the ground. My toe is going to be plantar flexed at that point, so I get a nice fascial pull from the shin muscles as it relates to the quad. All right, so this will be kind of level one, half kneeling. I can also create more knee bend or knee flexion by elevating my back foot. And at that point, I'm now going to force my quad to pull more because my knee is bent more. So one of the quad muscles, your rec fem, is also a hip flexor. So right now it's being pulled at the hip as well as at the knee. So same, notice the commonality, nice hip tuck posture as I drive my pelvis forward. And it's definitely much more aggressive to do this with the foot elevated. I'm sure many of you know that. So go through all those different variations. They all are slightly different. Common thread between all of them is that tuck tailbone posture, and that is going to be a nice way to give the anterior hip a little bit more mobility before you get into some of the more, for us, it's going to be then global stretches and then the activation by way of the matrices. So everything has a nice kind of PEMDAS order of operations before we start getting into the workout itself. So to recap and review, I started with the soft tissue work, which we did a number of videos, spending months doing that. So from the anterior hip standpoint, I would roll hip flexors and quads, go right into my local mobility as it relates to the hip flexors and quads. And then from here, months later, we'll go through some of the global stretches and show you how we go through those variations. So enjoy these. If you have any questions, as usual, don't hesitate, and talk to you next week.